Welcome to Cafe Tales. In today's episode, we journey to the marble halls of Calcutta, India in November 1928, where beneath the glittering crystal of a Venetian chandelier, the heir to a Maharaja's fortune lies crushed and lifeless. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing to the channel. You can also join our membership for ad-free exclusive mysteries. Link is in the description. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Reading your comments always brings me joy and motivation. Now settle in with a hot cup of Indian tea. Stay curious and let's get started. Murder in Maharaja's Palace. Chapter 1. An invitation most unexpected. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of our comfortable flat in Whitehaven Mansions. As I pushed open the front door, rather breathless from my constitutional through Hyde Park. The October air had been particularly bracing, and I had perhaps walked with more vigor than usual, inspired by the crisp autumn morning and the sight of the changing leaves. My cheeks were still ruddy from the cold when I hung my hat and walking stick in their accustomed places. "Ah, mon ami Hastings," came the familiar voice from the sitting room. "You return at the precise moment. Come quickly. There is something most interesting that requires your attention." I found Hercule Poirot seated at his immaculate desk, his egg-shaped head bent over what appeared to be an extraordinarily ornate piece of correspondence. Even from across the room, I could see that the paper was of the finest quality, thick and cream-colored with what looked suspiciously like gold edging. My friend held the letter between his small manicured hands with the reverent care one might reserve for handling a priceless manuscript. "I say, Poirot," I began, settling into my favorite armchair. "You look as though you've received word from royalty itself. Mon ami Hastings, your powers of observation, they improve daily." His green eyes sparkled with unmistakable delight as he carefully adjusted the letter so that it lay perfectly parallel to the edge of his desk. But not royalty of England. Something far more exotic, far more intriguing. He rose from his chair with that precise, almost fussy movement that was so characteristic of him, straightening his immaculate waistcoat before approaching my chair. The letter was extended toward me with a flourish that suggested he was presenting me with a rare treasure. The moment I took the correspondence in my hands, I understood his excitement. The paper was indeed edged in gold, and at the top was embossed a magnificent seal featuring an elaborate coat of arms, surmounted by what appeared to be a jeweled crown. The script was elegant, flowing, written in the most beautiful penmanship I had ever encountered. "Good Lord," I exclaimed, scanning the opening lines. "This is from the Maharaja, let me see, Rajatendra Narayan Roy of Bengal. How on earth did you come to receive such a thing?" "Ah, that is a story most interesting," Poirot replied, returning to his desk and settling himself with evident satisfaction. "Do you recall perhaps the case of the Whitechapel art forgeries from this past spring?" I nodded, remembering the curious affair of the missing Renaissance paintings that had kept us both occupied for several weeks. Bang! It appears that our work came to the attention of certain, shall we say, distinguished circles. This Maharaja, he has heard of the reputation of Hercule Poirot, and he writes to invite us, news, Hastings, to Calcutta for a most magnificent cultural exhibition. My eyes widened as I continued reading the elegant script. "I say, Poirot, this is quite extraordinary. He's inviting us to stay at something called the Marble Palace. Apparently, it houses one of the finest collections of European art in all of India." Exactament. And you see there, toward the end of the second paragraph, the Maharaja. He mentioned specifically his collection of Venetian glass and Belgian masterpieces, n'est-ce pas, Hastings? Clearly, this is a man of most refined taste and discernment. I could not help but smile at my friend's obvious pride. It was perfectly characteristic of Poirot to be particularly flattered by any mention of his homeland, however tangential, But surely, I said, setting the letter carefully on the small table beside my chair. You're not seriously considering such a journey? India is frightfully far, and the climate at this time of year— The climate, it will be most agreeable in November, Poirot interrupted, his tone suggesting he had already given the matter considerable thought. And consider, mon ami Hastings, when shall we again have such an opportunity to see the artistic treasures of the East, to experience the hospitality of Indian royalty, to examine works of art that few European eyes have ever beheld? He paused, smoothing his mustaches with evident satisfaction before continuing. Already I have been making the preliminary inquiries. This marble palace, it is famous throughout Bengal. Built in the Victorian era by a merchant prince, it houses not only Indian treasures, but also an extraordinary collection of European sculptures, paintings, and artifacts. The Maharaja's family has been collecting for 3 generations. I found myself caught up in his enthusiasm, despite my initial reservations. There was something undeniably appealing about the prospect of such an adventure, and I had long ago learned to trust Poirot's instincts about these matters. When would we need to depart? I asked, though I suspected from the gleam in his eye that he had already begun making arrangements. The exhibition opens in 3 weeks' time. If we sail next Thursday on the P&O steamer from Southampton, we arrive with time to spare for proper acclimatization. He gestured toward a neat stack of papers at the corner of his desk. I have already obtained the sailing schedules and begun the investigation of the accommodations. The prospect of such a journey filled me with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. India had always seemed impossibly exotic and distant, a land of spices and temples and mysterious customs that existed more in adventure novels than in reality. Yet here was an opportunity to experience it firsthand, in the company of my dearest friend, as guests of a genuine Maharaja. Poirot had returned to his letter, reading it once more with evident pleasure, his small hands adjusting it periodically to ensure it remained in perfect alignment with his desk's edge. Watching him, I realized that his mind was already made up, and that within the hour he would likely have our entire itinerary planned with his characteristic precision and attention to detail. Chapter 2. The Marble Palace. The assault upon the senses that was Calcutta in November began the moment we disembarked from the steamer at the Kitterpore docks. The humid air hung heavy with 1,000 different scents, spices and incense, coal smoke and flowers, the ever-present aroma of cooking food from the countless street vendors who seemed to line every available space. The cacophony was equally overwhelming, shouting dock workers, the clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages, the calls of hawkers selling their wares, and beneath it all, the constant hum of a city that never seemed to rest. Poirot, despite the oppressive heat, appeared as immaculate as ever. His traveling suit showed not a wrinkle. His mustaches remained perfectly waxed, and he surveyed the chaos around us with the detached interest of a scientist observing a particularly fascinating specimen. I, on the other hand, felt rather wilted already, my collar damp with perspiration despite the relatively early hour. "Mon Dieu," murmured Poirot, adjusting his tie with precision. "It is indeed a city of contrasts, this Calcutta." Our luggage was efficiently handled by a small army of porters, and within minutes we found ourselves settled in an elegant carriage sent by the Maharaja. The conveyance was beautifully appointed, with cushioned seats of deep burgundy leather and brass fittings that gleamed despite the dust of the streets. As we made our way through the teeming thoroughfares, I caught glimpses of the city's extraordinary character. Grand colonial buildings standing alongside ancient temples, European ladies in their crisp white dresses sharing the roads with sari-clad women carrying impossible loads upon their heads. "There, Hastings," Poirot said suddenly, pointing through the carriage window. "Regardez, if you please." I followed his gaze and felt my breath catch in my throat. Before us stood what could only be the marble palace, and it was unlike anything I had ever imagined. The building rose like something from a fairy tale, its white marble facade gleaming in the afternoon sun. Ornate columns supported a series of terrace levels, each adorned with classical statuary that would not have looked out of place in a European museum. Lions and cherubs, gods and goddesses gazed down from their marble perches, creating an atmosphere that was both magnificent and slightly overwhelming. "Magnifique," Poirot breathed, his green eyes bright with appreciation. "It is as though someone has transported a piece of Renaissance Italy to the heart of Bengal." As our carriage drew closer, I could make out more details of the extraordinary structure. The grounds were extensive, with manicured gardens that showed the hand of a master landscaper. Peacocks strutted across the lawns with regal indifference, their brilliant plumage adding splashes of color to the pristine white and green of the palace and its surroundings. We were welcomed at the main entrance by a small reception committee led by a tall, distinguished gentleman in his early 60s. His bearing was unmistakably aristocratic, and though he wore European dress rather than traditional Indian attire, there was something in his manner that spoke of generations of nobility. "Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings," he said, approaching us with a warm smile and hands extended in greeting. "I am Maharaja Rajatendra Narayan Roy. Welcome to my home." The Maharaja's English was flawless, with only the slightest trace of accent to hint at his origins. His handshake was firm, his manner gracious, yet I detected a certain weariness in his dark eyes that spoke of recent troubles. "Your Highness," Poirot replied with a formal bow, "the honor is entirely ours. To be guests in such a magnificent establishment is a privilege beyond measure. Please, you must call me Rajatendra, or simply Rajatendra if you prefer. We are not formal here." His smile seemed genuine, though I noticed that it did not quite reach his eyes. "Come, you must meet my family and see something of the collection before we dine." As we were led through the entrance hall, I found myself gaping like a schoolboy. The interior was even more spectacular than the facade had promised. The walls were lined with oil paintings, portraits, landscapes, religious scenes in magnificent gilded frames. Marble sculptures occupied every alcove and corner, their classical forms creating an atmosphere of refined elegance that was quite breathtaking. The collection was begun by my grandfather, the Maharaja explained as we walked. He had a great passion for European art and spent much of his fortune acquiring these pieces during his travels to London, Paris, and Rome. It was then that I first laid eyes upon the other members of the household. A young man emerged from one of the side corridors, and I knew immediately that this must be Arunendra, the heir. He was perhaps 28 or 30, handsome in a rather dissolute way, with a kind of easy charm that suggests a life of privilege and indulgence. His smile was quick and engaging, but there was something in his manner, a restlessness perhaps, or a faint air of desperation, that put me slightly on edge. "Father," he said, approaching our group with languid grace, "you did not tell me our guests had arrived?" "Arunendra," the Maharaja replied, and I thought I detected a slight tightening around his eyes. "May I present Monsieur Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings?" The introductions were made with all proper courtesy, but I sensed an undercurrent of tension between father and son that neither quite managed to conceal. Arunendra's handshake was perhaps a little too firm, his smile a little too bright, as though he were making a conscious effort to project an image of confidence and reliability. We were soon joined by another young man, this one perhaps 3 or 4 years younger than Arunendra, with a more serious demeanor, scholarly even. Prabhat Roy was introduced with obvious paternal pride. "Prabhat has recently returned from Cambridge," the Maharaja explained, "where he read history and art appreciation. He has become quite the expert on our collection." Where Arunindra's manner was expansive and somewhat theatrical, Prabhat was reserved, almost scholarly. He bowed politely to both Poirot and myself, but I noticed that his eyes lingered on his elder brother with an expression that was difficult to read, respect mixed with something that might have been resentment. The tour that followed was remarkable. Room after room revealed new treasures, Ming vases standing alongside Venetian glass, oil paintings by European masters hung beside exquisite Indian miniatures, marble sculptures that would have graced the finest museums of Europe arranged in elegant profusion throughout the palace's many chambers. Yet, as magnificent as the setting was, I found myself increasingly aware of the undercurrents of tension that seemed to flow just beneath the surface of this royal household. There were glances exchanged, conversations that stopped abruptly when we approached, and a general atmosphere that suggested all was not entirely well in this marble paradise. As evening approached and we were shown to our rooms to dress for dinner, I reflected that while the Marble Palace was indeed one of the most beautiful places I had ever seen, it seemed to hold secrets behind its pristine facade. Chapter 3. Shadows Behind Marble. The cultural exhibition began with great ceremony the following morning. The main hall of the Marble Palace had been transformed into a gallery that rivaled any I had seen in London or Paris. Priceless artifacts were displayed on velvet-draped pedestals, while spotlights, a modern innovation that seemed somewhat incongruous in the classical setting, illuminated the treasures with dramatic effect. I stood beside Poirot, watching as distinguished guests from Calcutta's European and Indian communities moved through the displays with evident appreciation. The little Belgian was in his element, examining each piece with the keen eye of a connoisseur, occasionally making observations that demonstrated his remarkable knowledge of art and antiquities. "Très bien," he murmured, pausing before a collection of Venetian glass that caught the morning light with prismatic brilliance. "These pieces, they are of the finest quality. Murano glass of the 18th century, if I am not mistaken." "You have an excellent eye." "Monsieur Poirot," came a voice from behind us. We turned to find a gentleman of perhaps 50 years, impeccably dressed in European fashion, but with the slightly weathered complexion of one long resident in the tropics. "Edwin Harcourt," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "I am an art dealer specializing in European works for the Indian market." There was something in Mr. Harcourt's manner that struck me as carefully calculated. His smile was pleasant enough, but his eyes held a sharp, assessing quality that reminded me rather unpleasantly of a hawk evaluating potential prey. "Ah, monsieur," Poirot replied with evident pleasure. "Then you must indeed know much about this magnificent collection. Perhaps you could enlighten us about the provenance of some of these remarkable pieces?" "Certainly, certainly," Harcourt replied, though I noticed his gaze drift toward the far end of the hall where Arunendra stood in animated conversation with another gentleman. The Maharaja's grandfather was a most discerning collector. Many of these pieces were acquired during the great European tours of the 1870s and 1880s. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Arunendra approached our group. In the daylight, the dissolute quality I had noticed the previous evening seemed even more pronounced. His clothing was impeccable, but there was something in his manner, a restlessness, a tendency for his eyes to dart about the room, that suggested inner turmoil. "Mr. Harcourt," he said, his tone carrying an edge that was barely concealed beneath the social pleasantries, "I trust you are enjoying the exhibition?" "Indeed, Your Highness. The collection is as magnificent as ever." Harcourt's reply was smooth, but I caught a meaningful glance that passed between the two men, lasting only a moment, but charged with significance. "If you will excuse us." "Gentlemen," Arunendra said with a forced smile, "Mr. Harcourt and I have some business matters to discuss." The two men moved away together, and I observed their departure with growing curiosity. Their conversation, conducted in urgent whispers near one of the display cases, was clearly of an intense nature. Aranendra's gestures were sharp and agitated, while Harcourt maintained the calm demeanor of a man accustomed to difficult negotiations. "Most curious," Poirot murmured beside me, his green eyes following the pair with evident interest. "There are undercurrents here, mon ami, that disturb the little gray cells." Before I could respond, our attention was drawn to a commotion near the entrance. A vision of grace and beauty glided into the hall, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The young woman was clearly Indian, dressed in a sari of deep emerald silk that complemented her dark beauty perfectly. Her movements possessed the fluid elegance of a trained dancer, and indeed, as she was introduced to various guests, I learned that this was Maya Devi, a renowned classical dancer who had performed throughout India. What struck me as particularly interesting was the young lady's reaction upon seeing Aranendra. For a moment, her composed expression faltered, and I glimpsed something in her dark eyes, pain perhaps, or anger, before the mask of polite indifference slipped back into place. When the heir approached her with obvious eagerness, she turned away with deliberate coolness, engaging herself in conversation with other guests rather than acknowledge his presence. "Tia," Poirot observed quietly. "The heart. It has its own mysteries, does it not?" The morning progressed with a series of small incidents that individually might have seemed insignificant, but which collectively created an atmosphere of mounting tension. I observed Prabhat Roy standing alone near a display of ancient manuscripts, his scholarly face dark with what appeared to be suppressed resentment as he watched his elder brother's increasingly desperate attempts to engage Maya Devi in conversation. Later, while examining a magnificent collection of European portraits, I overheard a fragment of heated discussion between Arunendra and his father. The words were spoken in Bengali, but the tone was unmistakable, Arunendra pleading, while the Maharaja's responses grew increasingly stern and final. "Mon ami Hastings," Poirot said, appearing at my elbow with his characteristic silent approach. "Observe, if you please, the painting before which we stand." I looked up at the portrait in question, a magnificent work depicting a European nobleman of the Renaissance period, painted with remarkable skill and attention to detail. "It is beautiful," I said, though I confessed I could not see what particular significance it held for my friend. "Beautiful." "Yes," he replied, "but notice the signature in the corner, and then regard the style of the brushwork and the shadows." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Most interesting, the provenance of such a work. Before I could ask what he meant, we were interrupted by the approach of Prabhat Roy, who had apparently overheard our conversation. "You have a good eye, Monsieur Poirot," he said with quiet intensity. "That particular piece has always fascinated me. There are questions about its history that I have been researching." Something in his tone suggested that these questions went far beyond mere academic interest. The younger son's gaze lingered on the painting with an expression that was difficult to interpret. Was it suspicion, or perhaps something more sinister? The afternoon wore on with increasing undercurrents of tension. I observed Maya Devi's continued avoidance of Aranendra, noting how her graceful movements always seemed to place her at the opposite end of any room he entered. Harcourt appeared and disappeared with suspicious frequency, always engaged in whispered conversations with various guests, his calculating gaze never at rest. Most disturbing of all was the gradual change in the Maharaja himself. The gracious host of the previous evening seemed to age before my eyes, his shoulders sagging slightly under some invisible burden, his warm smile becoming increasingly forced as the day progressed. As evening approached, and the last of the exhibition guests departed, I found myself standing with Poirot in the main hall, surrounded by the magnificent treasures that had drawn us halfway around the world. Yet despite the beauty of our surroundings, I could not shake the feeling that we had stumbled into something far more complex and potentially dangerous than a simple cultural exhibition. The ancient palace, with its marble walls and classical statuary, seemed to hold secrets in every shadow, and I sensed that before our visit was concluded, those secrets would demand a reckoning. Chapter 4. Death Falls from Above. The evening soiree had reached its magnificent height when disaster struck with the sudden, terrifying finality that only death can bring. The main hall of the marble palace blazed with the light of a dozen crystal chandeliers. Their Venetian glass cast rainbow patterns across the assembled guests. The cream of Calcutta society moved in elegant clusters beneath the soaring ceiling, their evening dress creating a kaleidoscope of silk and jewels against the pristine marble backdrop. I stood near one of the tall windows, a glass of excellent champagne in my hand, watching Poirot as he engaged in animated conversation with a distinguished Bengali gentleman about the finer points of European sculpture. The little Belgian was clearly in his element, his green eyes bright with enthusiasm as he gestured toward a particularly fine piece of classical statuary. The atmosphere was one of cultured refinement, with soft chamber music providing an elegant accompaniment to the gentle buzz of conversation. Servants in crisp white uniforms moved silently through the crowd, offering refreshments from silver trays, movements as precise and choreographed as a ballet. It was then that I noticed Aranendra making his way toward the center of the hall, where the largest and most magnificent of the chandeliers hung suspended from the ornate ceiling. Moved with the slightly unsteady gait of a man who had perhaps indulged too freely in the evening's libations, though whether from alcohol or some other cause I could not determine, Aranendra paused directly beneath the massive fixture, a wine glass in his hand, and looked up at its intricate crystal formations with an expression that seemed oddly contemplative. The chandelier was truly a masterpiece, hundreds of individual pieces of Venetian glass arranged in elaborate tiers, creating a cascade of light that transformed the entire hall into something magical. Magnificent, is it not? Came a voice beside me. I turned to find Prabhat Roy at my elbow, his scholarly face tilted upward toward the same chandelier that held his brother's attention. Indeed, I replied. It must be worth a king's ransom. More than that, Prabhat said quietly, his tone carrying an undertone I could not quite identify. It has been in our family for nearly 60 years. My great-grandfather acquired it from a Venetian palace that was being demolished. There was something in his manner as he spoke these words, attention, perhaps, or a significance that seemed to extend beyond mere family history. His eyes remained fixed on his brother's figure beneath the glittering fixture with an intensity that struck me as rather unsettling. Across the room, I observed Maya Devi performing an impromptu classical dance for a small group of admirers. Her movements were poetry in motion, each gesture flowing seamlessly into the next with the grace of centuries of tradition. Yet even as she danced, I noticed her dark eyes occasionally drift toward Aranendra with an expression that mingled sorrow and something that might have been contempt. The Maharaja stood near the main entrance, playing the gracious host with practiced ease. Yet I could see the strain in his bearing. His conversations were punctuated by glances toward his elder son, and each time his gaze fell upon Aranendra, I observed a deepening of the lines around his eyes. Edwin Harcourt moved through the crowd with the calculated precision of a man conducting business even in social settings. I watched him engage various guests in brief, intense conversations, always maintaining that sharp, assessing expression that had struck me so forcibly during our first meeting. It was precisely at 9:30, I noted, the time on the ornate clock that graced the far wall when the unthinkable occurred. Aranendra had raised his wine glass as if to propose a toast to the assembled company when a sound like thunder filled the hall. The massive chandelier, that masterpiece of Venetian craftsmanship, plummeted from the ceiling with devastating force. The crash was tremendous, crystal shattering, metal twisting. The very foundations of the palace seemed to shudder under the impact. Screams filled the air as guests scattered in all directions, their evening finery forgotten in the face of sudden terror. When the chaos subsided and the last fragments of crystal had ceased their deadly rain, a horrifying sight met our eyes. Aranendra lay motionless beneath the wreckage of the chandelier, his body crushed by the enormous weight of metal and glass. His wine glass had shattered beside him, its contents spreading in a dark stain across the marble floor. In the stunned silence that followed, I heard the Maharaja's voice, broken and barely recognizable. My son. My son. The transformation in Poirot was instantaneous and remarkable. Gone was the cultured gentleman discussing art and antiquities. In his place stood the detective I knew so well, his sharp eyes already cataloging details that others in their shock and horror failed to observe. While servants rushed to clear the crowd and summon the authorities, Poirot approached the scene with careful, measured steps. I followed, watching as his keen gaze took in every aspect of the tragedy. "Mon ami," he murmured, kneeling beside the wreckage with surprising agility for a man of his years. "Regardez, Hastings, the chain that supported this magnificent fixture." I bent down to examine the twisted metal, and even my untrained eye could see what had captured his attention. The chain showed clear evidence of having been filed through with precision, the cuts made with deliberate care, rather than resulting from natural weakness or age. Good heavens, I breathed, the implications beginning to dawn upon me. "You mean this was premeditated?" "Précisément," Poirot interrupted quietly, his voice barely audible above the continuing commotion. "This was no accident, mon ami. But regard also this." His small, precise hand indicated a silk scarf that had somehow become entangled in Aranendra's shawl. The fabric was of beautiful quality, embroidered with an intricate pattern that included what appeared to be some form of insignia or symbol I did not recognize. "Most curious," Poirot continued, his nose wrinkling slightly as he leaned closer to the shattered wine glass. "The aroma, Hastings, can you detect it?" I bent closer and caught a faint but unmistakable scent. Bitter, medicinal, quite unlike anything wine should possess. "The little gray cells," Poirot said, rising to his feet with that characteristic precision of movement. "They are most disturbed. What appears to be a tragic accident caused by the decay of an ancient palace is, I fear, something far more sinister. Around us, the evening's guests were being gently but firmly escorted from the hall by servants and the local authorities, who had arrived with remarkable speed. The Maharaja stood like a statue carved from grief itself, his face gray with shock and loss. Prabhat Roy had moved to his father's side, offering what comfort he could, while Maya Devi had ceased her dancing and stood frozen near the far wall, her hands pressed to her mouth in horror. Edwin Harcourt, I noticed, had disappeared entirely from the scene, though whether he had departed with the other guests or simply melted away into the shadows of the palace, I could not determine. As the hall slowly emptied and the full magnitude of the evening's tragedy began to settle upon us all, I found myself looking up at the ceiling where the chandelier had hung for 6 decades, a beautiful and innocent ornament that had been transformed into an instrument of death. The very marble walls seemed to whisper of secrets and deceptions, and I realized that our visit to this magnificent palace had taken a turn that none of us could have anticipated. Chapter 5. The investigation begins. The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of the marble palace as Poirot began his methodical investigation. The main hall had been sealed by the local authorities, but my friend's reputation had preceded him even to Calcutta, and Inspector Das of the Bengal Police had readily granted him permission to examine the scene and question the household. I served as Poirot's faithful assistant, taking notes and running errands throughout the vast palace while he conducted his interviews with characteristic precision. Each conversation revealed new layers of complexity beneath the tragedy that had befallen the royal household. Our first interview was with the Maharaja himself, conducted in his private study, a room lined with ancient texts and family portraits that spoke of generations of noble lineage. The grief-stricken father sat behind his mahogany desk, his hands trembling slightly as he attempted to maintain his composure. "Monsieur Poirot," he began, his voice heavy with sorrow, "I confess I am baffled by your suggestion that my son's death was not accidental. Who would wish harm upon Aranendra?" Poirot leaned forward in his chair, his green eyes gentle but penetrating. "That, Your Highness, is what we must discover. But first, perhaps you could tell us of your son's recent circumstances. Were there any troubles? Any concerns that weighed upon his mind?" The Maharaja's composure faltered for a moment, and I saw him struggle with some internal conflict before speaking. Arunendra was, how shall I put this delicately? A young man of passionate nature. He had developed certain unfortunate habits. Gambling, perhaps? Poirot suggested quietly. "Among other things," the Maharaja admitted with evident pain. "His debts had become substantial. I had recently been forced to intervene to prevent scandal. And the extent of these debts? Several lakhs of rupees, a fortune that could have seriously threatened our family's financial stability." The old man's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "We had argued about it only yesterday. Harsh words were spoken between us." Poirot made a note in his small leather notebook before continuing. "Was there perhaps a romantic attachment that caused concern?" The Maharaja's face darkened. He had formed an inappropriate attachment to Maya Devi, a talented young woman to be sure, but not of suitable background for marriage into our family. I had forbidden the association. When we took our leave, I could see that Poirot's little gray cells were already working furiously on the information we had gathered. Our next interview was with Prabhat Roy, whom we found in the palace library, surrounded by ancient manuscripts and art catalogues. The youngest son received us with scholarly courtesy, though I detected an underlying tension in his manner. "My brother's death is a terrible tragedy," he said in response to Poirot's gentle questioning. "Though I confess, Monsieur Poirot, that Arunendra and I had grown somewhat estranged in recent months." "Ah, mon ami. And what was the cause of this estrangement?" Prabhat's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Arunendra had little interest in our family's heritage, our responsibilities. He saw our collection, our palace, merely as assets to be converted to cash when his gambling debts demanded it. "That must have been painful," Poirot observed. "For one of your scholarly disposition. Indeed. I had devoted years to cataloging and researching our treasures, only to watch my brother prepare to sell them piece by piece. With father's death, I would have inherited nothing but debts and empty halls." It was a revealing statement, and I saw Poirot make another careful note. Later that afternoon, we paid another visit to Edwin Harcourt at his hotel in the European quarter of the city. The art dealer received us in his suite, which was filled with shipping crates and catalogues from various auction houses. "Tragic business. This," he said, offering us chairs and refreshments. "Poor Aranendra was a valued client of mine." "In what capacity?" Poirot inquired with deceptive casualness. "I occasionally helped him with acquisitions. Young men of his station often develop expensive tastes that exceed their immediate resources." "Acquisitions?" I interjected. "Do you mean purchases?" Harcourt's smile was thin and calculating. "Sometimes purchases, sometimes sales. The art market is complex, gentlemen, particularly when it involves family collections and questions of, shall we say, immediate liquidity." Poirot's eyes sharpened. These transactions, they were all conducted with the full knowledge and approval of the Maharaja. The dealer's hesitation lasted only a moment, but it was enough to confirm Poirot's suspicions. Business arrangements between gentlemen are often conducted with a certain discretion. When we left Harcourt's hotel, I was bursting with questions, but Poirot remained thoughtfully silent until we had returned to the palace. Our final interview of the day was with Maya Devi, whom we found in the palace gardens, practicing her classical dance forms. Her movements were as graceful as ever, but I could see the strain of recent events in her dark eyes. "Arunendra was a complicated man," she said when Poirot gently broached the subject of their relationship. "Charming, yes, but also weak. He made promises he could not keep, both to me and to others." "You refer perhaps to promises of marriage?" Poirot suggested. "Among other things." Her voice carried a note of bitter disappointment. "I discovered that his intentions toward me were not honorable. He had debts, terrible debts, and he saw in me perhaps a way to escape them." "How so?" "There are men who would pay well for certain arrangements. Arunendra had suggested that I might assist him in settling his obligations through performances for private parties. When I refused and threatened to expose his proposal to his father, he became quite desperate." The implications of her words sent a chill through me, and I saw Poirot's expression grow grave. As evening fell, my friend and I made our way to Arunendra's private chambers, which the authorities had left unsealed. The rooms were elegantly appointed, but showed signs of hasty searching. Drawers left partially open, papers scattered about, the general disorder of someone who had been looking for something specific. "Regardez, Hastings," Poirot said, indicating a small writing desk near the window. "The lock, it has been forced, but recently, after the death, I think. We searched the room systematically, and it was I who discovered the loose floorboard beneath the carpet near the bed. Hidden beneath it was a small journal bound in leather, its pages covered with what appeared to be some form of code or cipher." "Extraordinaire," Poirot murmured, examining the cryptic entries by lamplight. "Here we have dates, initials, numbers, clearly a record of transactions of some kind." Further searching revealed another disturbing discovery. Behind a loose panel in the wardrobe, we found several small canvases, oil paintings that appeared to be studies or copies of works I had seen in the palace's main collection. "Most curious indeed," Poirot observed, holding one of the paintings up to the light. "Why would the heir to such a magnificent collection possess what appear to be copies of his own family's treasures?" As we prepared to retire for the evening, I found myself overwhelmed by the complexity of what we had uncovered. The chandelier's deliberately severed chain, the coded diary, the suspicious art dealer, the bitter romantic entanglement, the family tensions. Each element seemed to point in a different direction, creating a web of motives and opportunities that defied simple explanation. Poirot, however, appeared oddly satisfied as he arranged his notes with characteristic precision on the writing desk in our guest quarters. His little gray cells were clearly working overtime, processing and analyzing the disturbing information we had gathered throughout this long and eventful day. Chapter 6. Secrets Written in Code. The morning brought with it a breakthrough that would prove pivotal to our investigation. Poirot had spent the better part of the night hunched over Arunendra's coded diary, his keen mind working to unlock the secrets hidden within those cryptic entries. I found him at dawn, still seated at the writing desk in our quarters, surrounded by sheets of paper covered with his neat handwriting. "Ah, mon ami," he said, without looking up as I entered with our morning tea. "The little gray cells, they have been most productive during the hours of darkness." I set down the tea service and peered over his shoulder at the diary, which now lay open beside several pages of translation. What I saw there made my blood run cold. Good Lord. Poirot, I breathed, scanning the decoded entries. These appear to be records of art sales. Précisément, mon ami. But not just any art sales. Observe the dates, the amounts, the initials that correspond to paintings we have seen in the palace collection. The entries were damning in their clarity once decoded. Aranendra had been systematically selling pieces from the family collection, replacing them with forgeries and using the proceeds to pay his gambling debts. The amounts involved were staggering, tens of thousands of rupees for individual pieces. But surely, I said, still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the deception, the Maharaja would have noticed if valuable paintings were disappearing from his collection. Poirot smiled grimly, tapping one of the forged canvases we had discovered the previous evening. That, mon ami Hastings, is the diabolical cleverness of the scheme. The originals were replaced with copies of such quality that only an expert would detect the substitution. We spent the morning conducting a systematic examination of the palace's art collection, armed with the information from Aranendra's diary. What we discovered was both fascinating and horrifying. Nearly a dozen of the most valuable pieces had been replaced with forgeries so skillful that they had fooled even the Maharaja's practiced eye. The brushwork here, Poirot observed, examining a supposed Titian with his magnifying glass. It is excellent, but the varnish, it is too new. And regard the canvas, modern preparation, not the centuries-old, weave of the original. Each discovery strengthened. The case that Aranendra had been conducting his deception on a massive scale. The diary revealed transactions dating back over 18 months, suggesting that the heir had been slowly looting his family's heritage to fund his dissolute lifestyle. It was during our examination of a particularly fine collection of Flemish miniatures that we encountered Prabhat Roy. The younger son appeared at the gallery entrance, his scholarly face grave with concern. Monsieur Poirot, he said, approaching us with obvious reluctance. I have been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and there is something I feel I must tell you. Parlez, monsieur. Pray continue. Prabhat glanced around nervously before speaking in lowered tones. I suspected that something was amiss with certain pieces in our collection. My research had led me to question the provenance of several works, but when I attempted to discuss my concerns with Aranendra, he became agitated. When was this? Perhaps a month ago. He accused me of trying to undermine him in father's eyes, of seeking to discredit him so that I might gain favor as the heir. Prabhat's voice carried genuine pain. The accusation was unjust, but it revealed how desperate he had become. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And did you share these suspicions with your father? I was torn. To expose Aranendra would have broken father's heart, but to remain silent felt like betraying our family's trust. He paused, his hands clasped tightly before him. In the end, I decided to conduct my own investigation before taking any action. And what did this investigation reveal? Evidence that confirmed my worst fears. Aranendra had been in contact with unscrupulous dealers, both here in Calcutta and in Europe. The scale of his deception was far greater than I had imagined. The implications of Prabhat's revelation were profound. If the younger son had discovered the extent of his brother's crimes, it provided him with a powerful motive for murder. The family's reputation, their financial stability, their very heritage, all hung in the balance. Later that afternoon, we paid another visit to Edwin Harcourt, this time armed with specific details from the decoded diary. The art dealer's composure cracked noticeably when Poirot presented him with documentary evidence of their transactions. Look here. Harcourt blustered, his earlier smoothness replaced by obvious anxiety. I operated under the assumption that young Aranendra had proper authority to conduct these sales. How was I to know he was acting without his father's knowledge? Come, monsieur, Poirot replied with gentle skepticism. A man of your experience in such matters must surely have suspected that something was irregular. The secrecy, the urgency, the requests for immediate payment. These are not the hallmarks of legitimate transactions. Harcourt's silence was telling. Finally, he admitted what we had already surmised. The boy was desperate. His debts were mounting, and he was receiving threats from some very unsavory characters. I may have overlooked certain irregularities in order to help him. For a substantial commission, no doubt, I observed. Business is business, Captain Hastings. I provided a service for which I was compensated. Our final visit of the day was to Maya Devi's modest lodgings in the artist's quarter of the city. The dancer received us with the same dignity she had shown at the palace, but I could see that recent events had taken their toll upon her. I knew something was troubling Aranendra deeply, she confided as we sat in her small but tastefully appointed parlor. In recent weeks, he had become increasingly erratic, speaking of enemies and dangers that I could not understand. Did he ever mention specific names or threats? Poirot inquired. He spoke of men who would do terrible things if he could not repay what he owed them. He begged me to help him, to use my connections in certain unsavory circles to arrange loans or other forms of assistance. And you refused? Of course. I am an artist, not a criminal. Her voice carried both sadness and resolve. When I realized the full extent of what he was asking, I told him that our relationship must end. That was 3 days ago. How did he respond to this rejection? He was furious, then desperate. He threatened to tell people that I had been involved in his schemes, to ruin my reputation if I would not help him. Tears appeared in her dark eyes. I realized then that the man I thought I loved had never truly existed. As we made our way back to the marble palace through the humid evening air, I found myself more confused than ever. Each interview had revealed new motives, new layers of deception and betrayal. The Maharaja had reason to silence a son who was bankrupting the family. Prabhat stood to inherit everything if his brother were removed. Harcourt needed to eliminate a partner who had become dangerously unreliable. Maya Devi had been betrayed and threatened by a desperate man. Poirot, I said as we approached the palace gates. I confess I am utterly baffled. Everyone we have spoken to had both motive and opportunity to kill Aranendra. Ah, mon ami, he replied with evident satisfaction. That is precisely what makes this case so fascinating. The little gray cells, they must work overtime to separate the wheat from the chaff, the genuine clues from the red herrings. As we entered the marble halls where our investigation had begun, I reflected on how quickly our cultural expedition had transformed into something far more sinister. The palace that had welcomed us with such splendor now seemed to hold secrets in every shadow, and I could not shake the feeling that we were still far from uncovering the complete truth behind Aranendra's death. Chapter 7. The Truth Behind the Marble. The third day of our investigation dawned with an atmosphere of mounting tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the marble palace. Poirot had risen before dawn, and I found him in our sitting room engaged in what he called his final verification, a methodical review of all the evidence we had gathered, arranged in neat piles across the writing desk with his characteristic precision. Mon ami, he said, as I entered with our morning tea, today, the little gray cells shall reveal their conclusions. But first, there are certain final details that must be confirmed. I observed that his demeanor had changed markedly from the previous evening. Gone was the puzzled concentration of the past 2 days. In its place was the quiet satisfaction I had learned to associate with a case nearing its resolution. Our first task was a return to the scene of the crime. The main hall had been cleared of debris, but the massive chandelier's mounting point in the ornate ceiling remained as stark evidence of the tragedy. Poirot examined the attachment with renewed interest. his keen eyes noting details that had previously escaped attention. "Regardez, Hastings," he said, pointing to the elaborate ceiling medallion from which the fixture had hung. "The workmanship here, it tells a most interesting story." I followed his gaze and saw what he meant. The metalwork showed clear signs of recent disturbance, scratches, and tool marks that were distinctly different from the patina, of age that covered the surrounding ornamentation. "Someone has been working here recently," I observed. "Précisément. But observe also the pattern of these marks. They suggest not hasty sabotage, but careful, methodical preparation. This was not the work of a moment, but of someone who had both time and access to complete the task properly." We next examined the exact spot where Arunendra had fallen. The marble floor had been cleaned, but Poirot's trained eye detected traces that others had missed. Using his magnifying glass, he studied what appeared to be faint stains that had resisted the servants' cleaning efforts. "Most instructive," he murmured, taking careful measurements with a small ruler he produced from his waistcoat pocket. "The position of the body, the pattern of the, shall we say, evidence. It confirms certain theories that have been forming in the little gray cells." Our investigation was interrupted by the approach of Inspector Das, the local police official who had been remarkably accommodating to Poirot's involvement in the case. "Monsieur Poirot," he said with evident respect, "I have received the report from our laboratory regarding the wine glass found at the scene." "You were quite correct in your suspicions." Poirot's eyes brightened with interest. "And what did this examination reveal?" "Traces of a substance not commonly found in wine, a bitter compound that our chemist believes to be derived from certain indigenous plants. In sufficient quantity, it would cause rapid unconsciousness, though not necessarily death." "Ah, très intéressant. And the quantity found in this particular glass?" "Enough to render a man insensible within minutes, but not enough to kill. The actual cause of death was clearly the crushing weight of the chandelier." This revelation sent my thoughts spinning in new directions. If Arunendra had been drugged before the chandelier fell, it suggested a level of premeditation that was chilling in its calculated precision. "Monsieur Poirot," continued Inspector Das, "I wonder if you might assist me with one final experiment. I should like to test a theory about the timing of events on the evening in question." Das readily agreed, and together we conducted a reconstruction of the evening's events, using servants to represent the positions of various guests. Poirot carefully recreated the moments leading up to the tragedy. What emerged was a timeline that revealed disturbing discrepancies in the testimonies we had gathered. "You see, Hastings," Poirot explained as we observed the reconstruction, "if we accept the statements given to us, then certain people were in two places simultaneously, a feat that even the most accomplished magician would find challenging." The afternoon brought our final interviews with the principal suspects. Poirot had requested that each be available for what he termed clarification of certain details, though I suspected his purpose was more significant than mere clarification. We began with the Maharaja, whom we found in his private study surrounded by account books and legal documents. The strain of recent events had aged him visibly, and his hands trembled slightly as he attempted to manage the complex business of his estates. "Your Highness," Poirot began with his customary politeness, "I wonder if you could clarify the exact nature of your son's financial difficulties. The coded diary suggests that the situation was even more serious than you initially indicated." The old man's composure cracked slightly. "The truth is, Monsieur Poirot, that Arunendra's debts threatened not merely scandal, but complete ruin. He had borrowed against expectations of inheritance, used the family name to secure credit." His voice broke. "He had been selling our treasures to pay his gambling obligations." "And you were aware of this?" "I suspected, when certain pieces seemed different. Upon close examination, I began to fear the worst. But to confront him directly would have meant, admitting that I had failed as a father. Our interview with Prabhat Roy revealed similar depths of family anguish. The youngest son admitted that his discovery of the art fraud had created an impossible dilemma. Felt torn between loyalty to my brother and duty to our family legacy, he confessed. When I realized the extent of the damage, I knew that drastic action was necessary to prevent complete disaster. What sort of action? I had decided to confront Aranendra directly, to demand that he cease his activities and make full confession to father. If he refused, Prabhat's voice trailed off meaningfully. You were prepared to expose him yourself. Our family's honor demanded it, regardless of personal cost. Maya Devi, when we spoke with her again, revealed additional disturbing details about Aranendra's final days. He had become increasingly desperate, she told us. He spoke of having one final opportunity to resolve his difficulties, some plan that would eliminate all his problems at once. Did he elaborate on this plan? No, but he seemed to believe that within days he would be free of all his troubles. He spoke as though he had discovered some solution that would restore his position and remove all threats to his future. Edwin Harcourt proved the most evasive of our subjects, his earlier cooperation replaced by obvious nervousness. I had warned Aranendra that our business relationship must end, he admitted reluctantly. The risks had become too great, and I could no longer justify my involvement in his enterprises. And how did he respond to this termination? He became quite agitated, threatened to expose certain irregularities in my own business practices if I withdrew my support. It was most unpleasant. As evening approached, and we prepared for what Poirot had announced would be his final revelation, I found myself more confused than ever by the web of motives and opportunities we had uncovered. Each suspect had compelling reasons for wanting Aranendra dead, and each had possessed the means and opportunity to accomplish the deed. Yet I could see from Poirot's satisfied expression that his little gray cells had processed all this information and reached a definitive conclusion. As he arranged his notes one final time and prepared for the dramatic denouement that was his trademark, I reflected on how the beautiful marble palace had become the setting for a tragedy that would forever alter the lives of all who dwelt within its pristine walls. Chapter 8, Order and Method Triumph. The drawing room of the marble palace had been transformed for Poirot's final revelation. The ornate chamber, with its priceless paintings and classical sculptures, provided a fitting backdrop for the dramatic denouement that was about to unfold. All the principal figures in our investigation had been assembled. The grief-stricken Maharaja, seated in a chair of carved ivory. Prabhat Roy, his scholarly face grave with anticipation. Maya Devi, her dancer's poise intact despite the obvious strain. Edwin Harcourt, who had arrived with visible reluctance and now fidgeted nervously with his watch chain. Inspector Das had positioned himself near the entrance, while several of his constables stood unobtrusively around the room's perimeter. The atmosphere was electric with tension as we all awaited Poirot's explanation of the tragedy that had shattered the palace's tranquil existence. My friend stood before the assembled company with his characteristic dignity, his small figure somehow commanding the attention of everyone present. His green eyes moved slowly from face to face before he began to speak. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, his accented English clear and precise. We gather tonight to resolve a mystery that has disturbed the little gray cells most profoundly. What appeared to be a tragic accident, the collapse of an ancient chandelier, was in truth a crime of remarkable cunning and calculation. He paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing. The evidence, it tells a story most complex. We have discovered forgeries replacing priceless originals, coded diaries revealing systematic theft, gambling debts of crushing magnitude, and personal betrayals that would drive a man to desperate measures. The Maharaja shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Prabhat's scholarly features remained impassive. Maya Devi's dark eyes never left Poirot's face, and Harcourt's nervous fidgeting intensified. Each of you, Poirot continued, possessed what the detective novelist calls the trinity of murder: motive, means, and opportunity. But Hercule Poirot, he looks beyond the obvious. He seeks not just who could have committed this crime, but who did commit it, and more importantly, why the murder was committed in precisely this manner. The chandelier, she was sabotaged. The chain was filed through with meticulous precision, not the hasty work of sudden passion, but the careful preparation of someone who understood both the mechanism and the dramatic effect required. Inspector Das nodded approvingly as Poirot outlined the physical evidence they had discovered. But the chandelier, she was not the true weapon of murder. Not the chandelier, she was merely, how do you say, the window dressing, the elaborate stage setting designed to conceal the real method of death. Murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled group. The laboratory analysis confirmed what the little gray cells had already deduced. Aranendra was poisoned before the chandelier fell, rendered unconscious by a bitter compound derived from indigenous plants. The falling fixture merely completed the illusion of accident. Poirot moved to stand before the great window that overlooked the palace gardens, his silhouette framed against the evening light. The silk scarf found with the body, this too was planted evidence, designed to suggest certain connections that existed only in the murderer's careful planning. But the embroidered insignia, when properly researched, told a different story entirely. He turned back to face the room, his gaze now fixed on one particular individual. The wineglass, the poison, the staged accident, all pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of the palace, access to both the victim and the chandelier mechanism, and most crucially, someone who understood that Aranendra's death would appear to solve multiple problems simultaneously. The tension in the room had become almost unbearable. I found myself holding my breath as Poirot approached the moment of revelation. But there was one element the murderer could not foresee. One piece of evidence that revealed the truth behind this elaborate deception. The coded diary, we contained records of art sales and gambling debts. But hidden within those same entries were references to a different kind of transaction entirely. Poirot produced the leather-bound journal from his waistcoat pocket. Concealed within the cipher were details of a plan, not Aranendra's plan, but the murderer's plan, to eliminate the heir and assume control of both the family fortune and the art forgery operation that had become so profitable. All eyes in the room turned toward Prabhat Roy, but Poirot shook his head gently. No, not the obvious suspect. Though he played his role well in directing suspicion toward himself, the true murderer required someone else to bear the guilt, someone whose motive appeared overwhelming. He moved to stand directly before Prabhat, his voice filled with quiet authority. The murderer was someone who had been conducting their own forgery operation, someone who had been systematically replacing genuine articles with copies, not to sell the originals, but to build a duplicate collection that would eventually surface after a convenient family tragedy. Someone who understood that with both the Maharaja and his heir dead, for yes, the Maharaja was intended to be the next victim, the remaining family member would inherit everything, including the original collection that would by then be safely hidden away. Prabhat Roy's composed facade finally cracked, his scholarly features contorting with a mixture of rage and defeat. "You cannot prove this," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. "Oh, contre coup, the hidden chamber behind your study contains not research materials, but the original paintings your brother thought he had sold. You had been intercepting his transactions, providing him with forgeries while keeping the genuine articles for yourself. When he became suspicious and threatened to expose the entire operation, you realized that his death had become necessary. Prabhat's shoulders sagged as the weight of Poirot's revelations settled upon him. Inspector Das moved forward, but Poirot held up a restraining hand. There is more. The plan. It was even more diabolical than simple fratricide. The same poison that killed Arunendra was already being administered in small doses to the Maharaja. His recent weakness, his trembling hands, his growing confusion, within weeks, he too would have died, apparently from grief and the strain of recent events. The devoted younger son would inherit everything: the title, the palace, the legitimate collection, and secretly, the original masterpieces that would eventually resurface through carefully orchestrated discoveries and acquisitions. The Maharaja gasped, his face pale with horror at the realization of how close he had come to sharing his son's fate. Inspector Das stepped forward as Prabhat Roy collapsed into a chair, all pretense finally abandoned. The scholarly mask had fallen away, revealing the calculating intelligence that had orchestrated such an elaborate scheme. As the constables led the murderer away, I found myself reflecting on the terrible irony of the case. The very intelligence and learning that had made Prabhat Roy seem so unlikely a suspect had been the tools he employed to construct his intricate web of deception and death. The Maharaja sat in stunned silence, grappling with the realization that he had lost not just one son to greed and ambition, but both. One to murder, the other to his own murderous calculations. Maya Devi wept quietly for what might have been, while Harcourt departed hastily, no doubt eager to distance himself from any association with the scandal. As we prepared to take our leave of the Marble Palace the following morning, Poirot paused for one final look at the magnificent building that had been the setting for such tragedy. "Mon ami, Hastings," he said softly, "marble may endure for centuries, but greed, it crumbles even the strongest of houses." The words seemed to echo through the halls as we departed, leaving behind a palace that would forever bear the scars of ambition and betrayal hidden beneath its pristine beauty. Epilogue. 3 days had passed since Prabhat Roy's arrest, and the Marble Palace had begun to assume something approaching its former tranquility. The remaining guests had departed. The authorities had concluded their investigations, and the Great Hall had been restored to its pristine condition, though a new, smaller chandelier now graced the ornate ceiling, a reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded beneath its predecessor. I found Poirot on the morning of our departure, seated in the palace gardens, watching the peacocks strut across the manicured lawns with their characteristic indifference to human concerns. His small, precise figure was perfectly groomed as always, but I detected in his manner a thoughtful melancholy that often followed the resolution of our more complex cases. "You know, Hastings," he said as I settled beside him on the marble bench, "there are certain details of this case that continue to exercise the little gray cells, not because they remain unsolved, but because they reveal the extraordinary depths of human duplicity." "I confess, Poirot," I replied, "that I'm still somewhat puzzled by certain aspects of the solution. How, for instance, did you determine that the coded diary contained Prabhat's plans as well as Arunendra's records?" "Ah, mon ami, that is indeed the crucial question." His green eyes brightened with the familiar satisfaction of explaining a particularly clever deduction. "When we first discovered the diary, you will recall that it appeared to contain only Arunendra's transactions. But the little gray cells, they were disturbed by certain inconsistencies in the handwriting." He produced a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket and gestured toward the palace. Upon closer examination with proper light, I discovered that several pages contained two distinct hands. Arunendra's hurried scrawl, but also a more careful scholarly script. Prabhat had been using his brother's diary to record his own plans, writing in a lighter ink that became visible only under strong illumination. Good Lord, you mean he was keeping his murder plans in the same book as his brother's confessions? Précisément. The arrogance, it is breathtaking, no? But also practical. Who would suspect that a man would document his crimes in his victim's own journal? And if the diary were discovered, suspicion would naturally fall upon Arunendra. This explanation illuminated much that had puzzled me, but other questions remained. And the art forgery scheme, I continued. How exactly did the two brothers' operations intersect? Poirot smiled with evident pleasure at this question. Here we see the true diabolical cleverness of Prabhat's plan. He had been commissioned by Harcourt to provide expert copies of the palace collection, ostensibly for insurance documentation, but actually for the art dealer's own nefarious purposes, insurance. Documentation, a common practice among collectors, but Prabhat realized that these documentation copies could serve a far more profitable purpose. When Arunendra began selling family treasures to pay his debts, Prabhat simply provided him with the forgeries he had already created, keeping the originals for himself. I felt my understanding of the case shift into perfect clarity. So Arunendra thought he was selling genuine pieces, but was actually disposing of forgeries? Exactement. And Harcourt, believing he was acquiring genuine masterpieces, paid full value for copies. Meanwhile, Prabhat accumulated a secret collection of authentic works that he planned to rediscover after the convenient deaths of his father and brother. The sheer audacity of the scheme was staggering, but surely such a plan required enormous patience and preparation. Indeed, I estimate Prabhat had been preparing this scheme for at least 2 years. His Cambridge education provided both the expertise and the connections necessary. His scholarly reputation gave him access to the finest forgers in Europe, and his position as the responsible son gave him complete freedom to move about the palace and handle the collection. A question that had been nagging at me finally surfaced. But Poirot, how did you discover that the Maharaja was being gradually poisoned? That revelation seemed to appear from nowhere. Ah, mon ami, the little gray cells. They noticed many small details that seemed insignificant individually. The Maharaja's recent correspondence, which I examined with his permission, showed a deterioration in handwriting over several months. His trembling hands, which all attributed to age and stress, followed a pattern too regular to be natural. He paused to adjust his tie with characteristic precision before continuing. But the crucial evidence came from the palace physician, Dr. Chatterjee, whom I consulted privately. When I described the symptoms, he immediately recognized the signs of chronic poisoning by indigenous plant extracts. A simple blood test confirmed trace amounts of the same compound found in Arunendra's wine. The same poison used on both father and son? Precisement, but administered differently. Arunendra received a massive dose to render him unconscious quickly. The Maharaja had been receiving tiny amounts in his evening tea over many weeks, enough to gradually weaken him and eventually cause what would appear to be natural death from grief and old age. The full horror of such calculated cruelty struck me. A son slowly poisoning his own father while pretending loving concern was a depth of evil that challenged comprehension. And Maya Devi? I asked, thinking of the graceful dancer whose life had been so cruelly disrupted. She has been offered a position with a prestigious dance company in Bombay, far from the shadows of this tragedy. The Maharaja, in his grief and guilt over failing to see his younger son's true nature, has provided her with a substantial settlement to ensure her future security. And Harcourt? He has departed for England rather hastily, claiming urgent business matters. I suspect Inspector Das will be corresponding with Scotland Yard regarding certain questionable art transactions that require investigation. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the peacocks and listening to the distant sounds of the city beyond the palace walls. Despite the resolution of the case, I found myself troubled by the waste and destruction we had witnessed. "Poirot," I said finally, "do you ever wonder if we might have prevented this tragedy had we arrived sooner?" "Mon ami Hastings," he replied gently, "the seeds of this crime were planted long before we received our invitation to Calcutta. Perhaps resentment, his sense of being overlooked and undervalued, his gradual transformation from scholar to schemer. These things developed over years of watching his elder brother's dissolute behavior go unpunished." He rose from the bench and straightened his waistcoat with that familiar gesture, "I knew so. Well, what we can do, what we have done, is ensure that justice triumphs over deception. The Maharaja will live, warned now against the poison that was slowly killing him. The true treasures of the collection will be restored to their rightful places, and a murderer will face the consequences of his actions." As we made our final preparations for departure, I reflected on the lessons of our Indian adventure. The marble palace stood as magnificent as ever, its white walls gleaming in the morning sun, but I knew that those of us who had witnessed its secrets would forever see shadows lurking behind its pristine beauty. The Maharaja bid us farewell with dignity and gratitude, though his grief remained evident in every line of his face. He had lost both sons, one to murder, one to his own murderous ambition, and would spend his remaining years rebuilding what they had nearly destroyed. As our carriage pulled away from the palace gates, I caught one last glimpse of those magnificent marble walls, and I could not help but think of Poirot's final words to the Maharaja. "Mon ami, marble may endure for centuries, but greed will always crumble the strongest of houses." Yet, as we began our journey back to England, I realized that while greed had indeed brought tragedy to the Marble Palace, it was the enduring power of truth and justice, embodied in my extraordinary friend's relentless pursuit of order and method, that would ultimately restore balance to a world too often corrupted by human weakness and ambition. The little gray cells had triumphed once again, and with them, the eternal hope that right would prevail over wrong, no matter how carefully that wrong might disguise itself behind marble facades and scholarly pretensions. And so our tale concludes in the marble drawing room of the Maharaja's palace, where Poirot has once again proven that no mystery, however elaborate its deception, can withstand the relentless application of logic and method. What did you think of this mystery? Were you able to solve it alongside the great detective? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and theories about this episode. If you enjoyed journeying with Poirot and Hastings through the galleries and corridors of colonial Calcutta, please give this video a like and subscribe for more classic detective stories. Your support helps me continue bringing these mysteries to life. Until next time, keep your wits sharp, your curiosity keen, and remember, marble may endure for centuries, but greed will always crumble the strongest of houses. This is Ali signing off from Cafe Tales.